The gun pressed cold against Seth Barker's temple was the last thing Frances Lockhart had expected to see when she kicked open the door of the Redemption Saloon. She had come to collect what was owed to her. Nothing more, nothing less. $200 in unpaid wages that Hector Grimes had been dodging for 3 months, and she had finally worked up the nerve to march through that swinging door and demand every last cent. But what she found instead stopped her cold in the doorway, the afternoon sun blazing behind her like a frame around a nightmare. Seth Barker, a man she barely knew and trusted even less, was on his knees in the middle of the saloon floor. His dark hat had been knocked clean off his head. There was blood running from a split above his eyebrow, and the man holding the gun to his skull was none other than Cole Grimes, Hector's youngest brother, a rattlesnake wrapped in leather and cruelty. Cole's eyes snapped to Frances the instant she stepped inside. His grin was slow and vicious, the kind that promised nothing good. "Well now," Cole said softly. "The Lockhart widow, perfect timing." Frances did not move. She stood in that doorway with her heart hammering so loud she could feel it in her teeth, and she looked at Seth Barker kneeling there, and something passed between them in the span of a single breath. She had seen that look before. It was the look of a man who had already calculated every exit and found them all blocked. It was the look of a man who was, against every reasonable expectation, still thinking about someone other than himself. "Get out, Frances." Seth's voice was low and steady despite the gun at his head. "This does not concern you." "She is staying right where she is," Cole said pleasantly, "because she is going to tell me where the deed to her land is hidden. Or I am going to decorate my brother's saloon floor with this stranger's brains." This was the moment, Frances would think later, that everything truly began. Not that first freezing winter on her claim 4 months ago. Not the telegram she had received from her dead husband's creditors. Not even the dark night 3 weeks prior when she had first met Seth Barker on the road outside Caldwell, Kansas, under a sky black as a verdict. Everything truly began right here, right now, in the suffocating heat of the Redemption Saloon, with a man's life hanging on a thread and Frances Lockhart being offered a choice she had not asked for and could not refuse. She looked at Seth. He shook his head almost imperceptibly. She looked at Cole Grimes and his oil-slick smile. And then she took a single step forward into the saloon, letting the doors swing shut behind her, and she said, "Put the gun down, Cole. I will tell you what you want to know." But even as the words left her mouth, she was already thinking about the derringer tucked into the waistband beneath her skirt, about the angle of the light, about the gap between what Cole Grimes thought he knew and what he did not. And she was thinking, with a complicated fury she could not quite name, about the man on his knees who had tried to warn her away, even with a gun pressed to his head. To understand how Frances Lockhart came to be standing in that saloon making deals with dangerous men, you have to go back 4 months to the week of October 1882, when she arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, with nothing but a battered trunk, a land deed to 160 acres of disputed claim, and a grief so enormous it had calcified inside her chest into something that felt, on good days, like iron, and on bad days, like rot. Her husband, Thomas Lockhart, had been dead for 5 months. He had gone ahead to Kansas in the spring of 1882, full of talk about the Homestead Act and fresh starts and land that could be theirs if they just worked hard enough and wanted it badly enough. Frances had stayed behind in Missouri to settle his mother's estate, promising to follow before winter. She had kept that promise. Thomas had not kept his promise to be alive when she arrived. A fever, the letter from the county had said. A fast, merciless fever that had taken him in 3 days. Frances had read the letter sitting at her kitchen table in Missouri, and she had not cried. She had thought about crying. She had believed, in some distant, theoretical way, that crying was probably the appropriate response to being 26 years old and suddenly alone in the world. But the tears had not come. What came instead was a calm, hard clarity, the same kind that sometimes descends on people in the middle of catastrophes, that tells you, with perfect precision, exactly what needs to be done, and in exactly what order. She needed money. She needed to get to Kansas. And she needed to decide what to do about the land Thomas had claimed before someone else did it for her. She had arrived in Caldwell on a Tuesday in October with the first bite of autumn in the air. The town was a rough, loud, ambitious place sitting right on the Kansas Indian Territory border, a cattle trail terminus that drew drovers, gamblers, merchants, lawmen, and every variety of desperate human being that the promise of money and movement could attract. Frances had checked into the respectable boarding house run by a woman named Dorothea Marsh and spent her first night lying awake listening to the sounds of a town that never entirely went to sleep, thinking about Thomas, thinking about the land, thinking about what her next move had to be. The land claim was complicated. Thomas had registered it properly, and the deed had come to Francis as part of his estate. But there was a man, Hector Grimes, who ran a considerable portion of the commercial life of Caldwell, including the saloon and 2 of the 3 general stores, who had apparently made some kind of verbal arrangement with Thomas before his death, an arrangement that Hector now claimed gave him first right to purchase the land at a price Francis considered an outright robbery. There was nothing in writing. Thomas had apparently trusted a handshake. Frances trusted nothing she could not read in black ink. She had taken a job at the Caldwell Hotel, managing the laundry and the linen accounts, because her money was thin, and she needed to eat while she sorted out the land situation. The work was hard and honest, and it kept her occupied, which she had learned was the best thing for grief, occupying your hands so your mind had less room to wander into the dark. It was on the road between the hotel and Dorothea Marsh's boarding house, 3 weeks after her arrival, on a night in early November when the wind had teeth and the stars were brilliant and cold overhead, that she first encountered Seth Barker. He had appeared out of the darkness on a horse so dark it was nearly invisible against the night, a big bay gelding that made no sound on the hard-packed road. Frances had heard the hoofbeats just in time to step to the side, and the horse had pulled up sharply, its rider cursing softly under his breath and bringing the animal under control with a practiced ease that, even in her fright, she noticed. "I beg your pardon," the man said, and his voice was quiet and serious, not the blustery apology of a man who did not mean it. "I did not see you." "No," Frances said. "You did not." She looked up at him. He was backlit by the stars, so she could not make out his features clearly, only the shape of him on the horse, broad through the shoulders, hat pulled low, something in the way he held himself that suggested both competence and restraint. He was not a young man and he was not an old one, somewhere in that middle ground where experience lives. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am fine," Frances said, and she kept walking. She heard him sit there on the road for a moment after she passed, and then she heard the horse move on, and that was the end of it. Or so she thought. She saw him again the next morning at the hotel, where he had apparently taken a room the previous evening. He was eating breakfast alone in the small dining room when she came through with the linen cart, and he looked up and recognized her immediately, and there was something in his expression that she could not quite read. Not guilt, exactly. More like acknowledgement. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, and kept moving. His name, she learned from Dorothea Marsh later that day, was Seth Barker. He was from Texas originally, Dorothea said, though he had been moving around for some years. He worked as a range detective sometimes, and sometimes as a hired investigator for land and cattle disputes, and sometimes just hired himself out as a hand on ranches that needed someone competent and steady. He was known to be honest, Dorothea said. He was known to be good with horses and better with a pistol. He was known to keep his word. "What brings him to Caldwell?" Frances had asked, trying to make the question sound idle. Dorothea had given her a look that was not quite knowing but was somewhere in that neighborhood. "I imagine the same things that bring most people to Caldwell," she said. "Opportunity or trouble, sometimes both." Frances had tucked this information away and tried not to think about it too much. She had other things to think about. Hector Grimes had sent her a formal letter through his lawyer, a parchment-dry man named Alderton, reiterating his claim to first purchase rights on the land and suggesting, with a politeness that barely concealed its threat, that things would go easier for everyone if Frances would simply sign the transfer documents and accept the offered price. Frances had read the letter twice, folded it neatly, placed it in her trunk, and then sat very still for a long time, letting the anger move through her like a river finding its course. She had no intention of selling to Hector Grimes. The land was hers. It had been Thomas's dream, and she had decided, somewhere on the long train ride from Missouri, that refusing to abandon it was the only way she knew how to honor a man she had loved and not had nearly enough time with. She was going to hold the land. She was going to work it if she had to work it alone. She was going to build something on it that lasted. What she had not anticipated was how actively Hector Grimes was going to work to prevent that. Strange things began to happen. Her wages at the hotel were shorted by $10 one week, and when she confronted the manager, a mealy-mouthed man named Pierce, he looked at his ledger with wide, innocent eyes and said the numbers were what they were, and he was sorry, but there must have been a misunderstanding. Frances knew there had been no misunderstanding. She knew Hector Grimes's name was all over this, invisible but unmistakable. Pierce owed Hector money. Half the businesses in Caldwell owed Hector money. That was how the man operated. He built a web of small debts and then pulled the threads whenever he needed something done. Then the window of her boarding house room was broken one night while she slept, a rock thrown through the glass in the small hours of the morning. Nothing was taken. No one came inside. It was a message, clean and simple. You are not safe here. You are not untouchable. Think about what you are risking. Frances had swept up the glass in the morning with steady hands and asked Dorothea to have the window repaired. She did not report the incident to the marshal, because she had already spoken to the marshal, a man named Dupree who was large and decorative and thoroughly in Hector Grimes's pocket. She was being squeezed, and she knew it, and she was trying to figure out what to do about it when Seth Barker knocked on the door of her room on the evening of November the 12th. She opened the door a crack, keeping the chain latched, because she had installed a chain on the 4th day after her arrival, another piece of the clear-eyed practicality that had replaced her tears. "Mrs. Lockhart," Seth said. He was standing in the hallway with his hat in his hands, and there was something careful in his posture. "I understand if this is not welcome, but I have some information about your land situation that I think you ought to hear." "Who told you about my land situation?" she asked. "It is a small town," he said. "These things are known." She looked at him through the crack in the door. He met her eyes without flinching, which she noted. Men who had something to hide did not usually meet your eyes. They met the floor, or they met a point slightly to the left of your face. "I am tired," she said, "and I am not in the habit of inviting strangers into my room to have conversations that concern my personal affairs." "That is wise," Seth said without irony. "Would you be willing to speak in the parlor downstairs? Dorothea can be present if you like." Frances considered this for a long moment. Then she said, "No thank you, Mr. Barker," and she closed the door. She stood with her back against it afterward, listening to the sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall, and she breathed slowly and told herself she had made the correct decision. She did not know this man. She did not know his angle. She did not know whether he was another of Hector Grimes's instruments, sent to charm or confuse or extract information she could not afford to give. She had survived 5 months of being alone and battered by the world by trusting nothing and no one, and that policy had kept her upright, and she was not about to abandon it for a quiet voice and an honest pair of eyes. Trust was a luxury, she had learned. And she was not currently in a position to afford luxuries. The next 10 days were hard. Her wages were shorted again, this time by $20, and Pierce at the hotel was no longer even pretending to be sorry about it. He told her flatly that business had been difficult and wages were being adjusted across the board. Frances looked at the other employees' faces when he said this and saw the truth written there plainly. This was not happening to anyone else. This was happening to her. She took on extra mending work in the evenings from some of the other boarders at Dorothea's, which helped a little, but the arithmetic of her situation was increasingly unfavorable. She needed a lawyer of her own to fight Alderton and Hector Grimes, and lawyers cost money, and the money was draining faster than it came in. She had also started to notice, in the way that a woman who is paying close attention to her surroundings notices things, that Seth Barker seemed to be paying attention to her surroundings too. Not in a threatening way. Not in the way that Cole Grimes's men watched her, with a flat, proprietary assessment, as though she were livestock being evaluated. Seth's attention was different. It was, she slowly came to recognize, protective. He was at the hotel most mornings when she arrived for her shift, eating breakfast or reading whatever newspaper had come in on the last stage. When she walked the 2 blocks between the hotel and Dorothea's at the end of her day, there was often a figure in the shadow of the buildings across the street, too still and too consistent to be accidental. Once, when 2 of Cole Grimes's men had begun to follow her at a distance on her evening walk, she had heard a door open somewhere behind them and had glanced back to see Seth Barker step out of the hardware store and begin walking in the same direction. The men had peeled off and disappeared before she reached the boarding house. She could not decide how she felt about this. Part of her was grateful, part of her was furious. She had not asked for a guardian. She had not asked for anyone to make her decisions about her safety for her. She had been managing her own safety, imperfectly but independently, and there was something in being watched over without her consent that chafed against the fierce autonomy she had been constructing out of necessity. On November the 22nd, a Saturday, Seth spoke to her again. She was at the dry goods store run by Mrs. Ilara Chen, one of the handful of Chinese merchants who had established a small but determined community in Caldwell, buying flour and salt when Seth appeared beside her at the counter with the same care in his posture that he always brought to approaching her. "Mrs. Lockhart," he said, "I have found out something important about Alderton, something that changes the entire legal picture of your land claim. I would like very much to share it with you." Frances set her flour on the counter and looked at him. Mrs. Chen was busy at the back of the store, giving them a degree of privacy. Frances said, "What are you getting out of this, Mr. Barker? What is in it for you?" The question did not surprise him. He seemed to have expected it. "Nothing," he said. "I know how that sounds. I am asking you to take it on faith, and I understand if you will not." "I will not," she said, and she paid for her flour and her salt, and she walked out of the store. She walked home with her chin up and her jaw set, and she told herself again that she had made the correct decision. She knew almost nothing about Seth Barker's history or his real purpose in Caldwell. The land dispute was something that could potentially benefit many parties. She could not rule out that he was working for someone, for Grimes, or for one of the other large cattle interests that had been eyeing the Lockhart claim. She could not afford to be naive. She had already lost one man she loved to the innocent assumption that things would work out because they ought to. But she lay awake that night listening to the wind move around the eaves of Dorothea's house, and she thought about Seth Barker's face when she had refused him. He had not looked offended. He had not looked manipulative. He had looked, in a way she did not entirely know what to do with, like a man who had expected to be turned away and had hoped otherwise anyway. December came in cold and merciless. The cattle trail was closed for the season, and Caldwell contracted around the people who stayed through the winter, the permanent residents and the stubborn ones and those with nowhere else to go. Frances considered herself in the third category, though she was working toward the second. She had found a lawyer, a young man just 2 years out of his training named Warren Holt, who had recently arrived in Caldwell from Wichita and did not yet owe Hector Grimes anything. Warren Holt was eager and somewhat nervous, but he was smart and he was honest, and when Frances spread Thomas's land deed and the correspondence from Alderton on his desk, he went through it methodically and confirmed what she already knew. The verbal agreement Hector claimed, with no witnesses and nothing in writing, was legally worthless. Her deed was valid. Her claim was sound. "So why," Francis said, "is Hector Grimes acting like it is not?" "Because the law on paper and the law as it is practiced in a town where one man controls the marshal and the mayor are two different things," Warren said, with a candor she appreciated. "The question is not whether you are right, Mrs. Lockhart. The question is whether being right will protect you." It was a very honest answer. She paid him his retainer from her increasingly thin reserves and walked home in the first real snow of winter, and she thought about that distinction between being right and being protected, and she felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. That same evening, Hector Grimes came personally to the hotel where she still worked. She was behind the front desk when he walked in, a big man in his 50s with silver hair and a self-satisfied bearing, dressed in a wool coat that had cost more than she earned in a month. He was accompanied by Alderton and by two men whose function was purely physical. He stopped in front of the desk and looked at her with the patient, considering expression of a man who believes time is on his side. "Mrs. Lockhart," he said, "I hope we can be civilized about this." "I have always been civilized, Mr. Grimes," she said. "You will find it in the paperwork." He smiled at that, the smile of a man who is not entirely without appreciation for spirit as long as it does not inconvenience him. "I have increased my offer," he said. "My attorney will send you the new figure. I think you will find it fair." "No offer for something that is not for sale is fair," Francis said. His smile faded a degree. "Mrs. Lockhart," he said, and the patience in his voice had acquired an edge. "You are a woman alone in a town that does not yet know you well, in a climate that is about to become quite inhospitable, with a legal situation that is going to be very expensive to maintain, and a land claim you have not yet set foot on. I say this not to frighten you, but because I believe you are a sensible woman and sensible women recognize when the arithmetic does not favor them." "The arithmetic favors whoever controls it," she said. "Good evening, Mr. Grimes." He left. She stood at the desk for a long time after, absolutely still, watching the snow fall past the window. Her hands, below the level of the desk where no one could see them, were shaking. Not with fear exactly, with rage, with the specific, burning fury of a woman who is being condescended to by a powerful man and is being given no effective tools to fight back. It was 2 days after this that the third and final moment came, the moment that broke through the wall she had built. She was walking from the hotel in the early evening, a Thursday, when two men she did not recognize stepped out of an alley directly in front of her. They were not Cole's regular men. These were strangers, brought in specifically for this purpose, and their purpose was written clearly on their faces. They were not there to talk. Frances took 2 steps back and her hand went to the derringer under her coat, and she had it out and leveled before either of them had completed his first step toward her. They stopped. She held the gun steady, which cost her more than she would ever admit because her heart was attempting to beat its way out through her ribs. "Back," she said. They exchanged a look. They had not expected the gun. But there were 2 of them and only one of her, and the derringer held 2 shots, and they both knew it. The one on the left began to move sideways, trying to flank her, and Frances tracked him with the gun and knew with cold clarity that the situation was about to go very badly in a way she did not have enough bullets to prevent. And then Seth Barker was there. She did not know where he had come from. He was simply there, behind the 2 men, with a Colt's revolver in his hand and a stillness around him that was more convincing than any amount of noise would have been. He said nothing. He simply waited. The men looked at the gun in Frances's hand, and then at whatever they saw in Seth Barker's face, and then they went away. Just turned and walked briskly back into the alley and were gone. Frances stood in the empty street with her derringer still raised and her breath coming in visible clouds in the cold air, and she waited for her heartbeat to slow down to something manageable, and then she lowered the gun and turned around. Seth was watching her with that careful, steady expression. He had holstered his own weapon. He said, "Are you all right?" She opened her mouth to say yes, to say she was fine, to say thank you and good night and turn around and walk away from him the way she had done before. She had the words ready. She had done it twice already and she could do it again, but something had changed. She did not know exactly when it had changed or why, but standing in the cold street with the ghost of real danger still moving through her blood, she found that the words would not come. The wall that she had built out of necessity and grief and hard experience had been absorbing blows for 2 months now, from Grimes and his lawyer and his men, and the shorted wages and the broken window and the barely veiled threats, and she was beginning to understand that standing alone behind a wall and refusing help was not the same thing as being safe. She had been confusing the two things. She had been confusing independence with invulnerability, and they were not the same thing at all. She looked at Seth Barker standing in the snow-dusted street of Caldwell, Kansas, on an evening in December of 1882, and she said, "What did you find out about Alderton?" He did not show any triumph. He did not say anything that acknowledged the significance of the moment. He said, "Can we go somewhere warm?" They went to Mrs. Chen's tea room, which was one of the few establishments in Caldwell where Frances felt genuinely comfortable. A small, clean space at the back of the dry goods store where Elara Chen served proper tea and did not engage in the social performances that exhausted Frances. Seth Barker sat across from her at the small table and wrapped both his hands around his teacup and told her what he had found. Alderton, he said, had a secret, a large and compromising secret. Before coming to Caldwell, Alderton had practiced law in Dodge City, and in Dodge City there was a land transaction that had involved forged documents, a widow who had lost her farm as a result, and a payment to Alderton that was recorded in a private ledger that Seth had obtained through a source he declined to name, but whose reliability he vouched for absolutely. "If Alderton's character and conduct become known in detail," Seth said, "his standing as a lawyer in any Kansas court is finished. And Hector Grimes's entire legal case regarding your land, such as it is, which is to say not much to begin with, loses its main advocate." Frances sat with this information and turned it over. "How do you have this?" she asked. "I told you," he said. "I have a source." "Who sent you here, Mr. Barker? Because no one does this kind of work for free, and no one keeps this careful an eye on a stranger without a reason, and I would like to know what the reason is." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved along the street and a door banged somewhere. Then he said, "I knew Thomas Lockhart." She had not expected that. She looked at him very directly and waited. "Not well," he said. "We met in Wichita 3 years ago doing adjacent work. We spent a week in the same town and shared meals a few times and talked the way men talk when they are away from home. He was a good man. He spoke about you." He paused. "When I heard he had died, and then when I heard about the situation with his land and his widow, I thought I would come and see if there was anything useful I could do." "Why did you not tell me this immediately?" she asked. "Because I thought it would not help," he said simply. "I thought if I said I knew your husband, you would think I was trying to leverage your grief to gain your trust. I thought the information about Alderton would be more useful than a personal connection you had no way to verify." She looked at him for a long time. The tea steamed between them. "What did he say about me?" she asked, and her voice was, for the first time in months, something other than controlled. Seth's expression shifted. It became something quieter and, she thought, more honest than anything she had seen on a man's face in a very long time. "He said you were the most capable person he knew," Seth said. "He said you scared him a little, in the way that capable people scare the people who love them. He said he was sorry to leave you behind in Missouri, and he was counting the days until you arrived." Frances looked down at her tea. She breathed carefully and evenly and did not let herself cry, because she had been not letting herself cry for 5 months, and she was not going to stop now in a tea room in Caldwell, Kansas. But something in her chest shifted, some weight that had been pressing there since the letter arrived, and she felt it move, and for the first time since Thomas died, she felt less entirely alone. "All right," she said. "Tell me the rest of what you know." The alliance that formed between them in the following weeks was, for a long time, entirely practical. They met in the mornings at Mrs. Chen's over tea, and they laid out the strategy piece by piece. Seth had contacts, a network built over years of range detective work, that Francis did not have. Francis had a specific, lawyerly intelligence and a gift for documentation and argument that Seth frankly admired. Warren Holt was brought into the full picture. Together, the three of them constructed the case that would undo Alderton. The Dodge City connection proved exactly as powerful as Seth had predicted. When Warren Holt sent a formal letter to the Dodge City court requesting certain records relating to the prior case, and when a copy of that letter somehow found its way to the Caldwell newspaper, Alderton's carefully maintained reputation began to crack. The newspaper ran a story. The story reached the ears of the circuit judge, who would have been expected to rule on any formal land dispute. The circuit judge, a man named Hargreaves who had dealt with Alderton before and had his own quiet suspicions, made certain inquiries. Within 3 weeks, Alderton resigned his position and left Caldwell on a Tuesday morning stage before most of the town was awake. He left no forwarding address. This should have been a resolution. This should have been the end of the threat. But Hector Grimes, stripped of his legal champion, did not take the development gracefully. He was a man who had operated by means of power and intimidation for too long to easily accept the failure of those methods. He was a man with a pride that had calcified into something dangerous. Which was how Frances found herself, on a Thursday afternoon in late December, walking into the Redemption Saloon to collect 3 months of unpaid wages from Pierce's ledger, which had been moved there after Pierce and the hotel separated ways, only to find Cole Grimes with a gun pressed to Seth Barker's head. Cole, unlike his brother, was not interested in legal maneuvering. Cole was interested in results, and his preferred method of achieving results was force applied directly and without elegance. He had apparently grabbed Seth on the street and brought him into the saloon, believing, correctly, that Seth Barker was the most effective obstacle between Hector Grimes and what Hector Grimes wanted. And he had clearly been waiting for an opportunity to get Frances too, because when she walked through that door, the look on his face was the look of a man whose plan has just delivered an unexpected bonus. "The deed," Cole said to Frances pleasantly. "I know you keep it on your person. You are that careful, and you have been that careful since November, so let us not play games. Give me the deed and this man goes free and you walk out of here and my brother gets what he wants and we are all done with this." Frances looked at Seth on his knees on the floor. The blood from the cut above his eyebrow had reached his cheek. He was very still, which she had learned was his particular version of controlled fury. She said, "And what guarantee do I have that either of us walks out of here?" Cole spread his free hand. "My word." "Your word," Frances said. "That is remarkably thin currency." The saloon was empty except for the 4 of them. Cole, the man standing behind the bar who was clearly Cole's and was clearly armed, Seth on the floor and Frances near the door. Through the window above the bar, she could see the cold blue sky of a December afternoon. She had the Derringer under her skirt. 2 shots. Cole was 6 feet from Seth and the man behind the bar was another 10 feet beyond that. The arithmetic was not favorable. She made her decision in approximately 2 seconds, which was about how long she had. She said, "All right," and she reached slowly under the hem of her skirt, watching Cole's eyes track the movement with eager anticipation, and she came out with the Derringer instead of the deed, and she fired once at the lamp above the bar, shattering it, and the room went dark in the bright explosion of kerosene. The room was not entirely dark because it was afternoon and there was window light, but it was dark enough, suddenly and shockingly enough, that Cole flinched, and in the moment that he flinched, Seth moved. He moved fast for a man who had been on his knees, with a gun to his head. He got one hand on Cole's gun arm and twisted, and the gun went off but went into the ceiling, And then there was a brief, violent struggle in the half-dark while Frances stood flat against the wall with her derringer still in her hand with one shot remaining, watching the man behind the bar come around it with his weapon drawn. She leveled her derringer at him. He stopped. "The next one does not go into a lamp," she said. He believed her. The struggle between Seth and Cole was over in approximately 30 more seconds, ending with Cole face down on the floor and Seth's knee in his back and Cole's gun in Seth's hand. And then it was very quiet in the Redemption Saloon except for heavy breathing and the settling creak of the building in the winter wind. Seth looked up at Frances from where he knelt on Cole Grimes's back. His expression was complex. "Nice shot," he said. "Thank you," she said. She still had the derringer raised. Her hands were steady. She discovered with a kind of distant scientific interest, not shaking at all. "You could have given him the deed," Seth said. "There was no guarantee he would have kept his word," she said. "And I am not in the habit of trusting the word of men who are pointing guns at people." She stopped, reconsidered her sentence. "People who are in my acquaintance," she finished. Seth noticed the pause. She could tell by the way something shifted in his expression very briefly before the controlled steadiness came back. He said, "We should get the marshal." "The marshal is Hector's man," she said. "Yes," Seth said. "But I sent a wire yesterday to the state attorney general's office about the marshal. He is about to have a more immediate set of concerns than helping Hector Grimes. Help me get this man tied up and we will go to the deputy instead." She looked at him. "You sent a wire to the state attorney general's office." "I was going to tell you this morning," he said. "But then I saw Cole's men watching the boarding house and I thought something was about to happen and I came to find you." "You sent a wire to the state attorney general's office," she said again, because this required a moment to fully absorb. "I did," he said. "Because the situation in Caldwell has gone on long enough and because some things require the weight of state authority behind them and because I thought Hector Grimes needed to understand that the reach of this extends beyond anything he can locally suppress." He paused. "Are you angry?" She thought about that. "No," she said slowly. "I am not angry. I am," she looked for the word, "adjusting." "To what?" he asked. "To the idea," she said carefully, "that someone sharing this problem with me does not mean I have lost ownership of it." Seth looked at her steadily for a moment. "Thomas told me you would be the hardest person to help he had ever known," he said. Despite everything, despite Cole Grimes on the floor and the smell of kerosene and the gun still in her hand, Frances Lockhart almost smiled. "He was right," she said. They tied Cole with rope from behind the bar and left the armed man sitting under the broken lamp with his hands raised, and they went to find the deputy. The deputy, a young man of 22 named Cahill, who had always been slightly uncomfortable with the corrupt arrangements of his superiors, showed a marked enthusiasm for doing his job correctly once Seth laid out the evidence against Cole Grimes and mentioned the state attorney general's involvement. Cole was put in a cell. The man from the bar was put in a cell beside him. A wire was sent to the state authorities. 3 days before Christmas of 1882, a deputy from the state attorney general's office arrived in Caldwell on the afternoon stage. He arrived with a warrant for Marshal Dupree and a range of accompanying documents that were, as Seth had predicted, far beyond anything Hector Grimes could locally suppress. Dupree was arrested. 2 of his deputies resigned rather than be arrested. The state appointed a temporary marshal who came from outside and owed nothing to anyone in Caldwell. It was not a complete or instant resolution of everything, because these things never were. But it was, unmistakably, a turning point. Hector Grimes was still a powerful man and he was still angry and he was not done, but the tools he had been using had been systematically removed, and the next several weeks saw his position erode in ways that had a quiet, inevitable quality, like watching a levee fail. Alderton was gone. His legal case was hollow. Dupree was gone and his replacement had no loyalty to Grimes. Cole was in a cell awaiting trial on charges that included assault and attempted extortion. And the story of Frances Lockhart's land claim, and the methods Hector Grimes had used to try to take it had made it into the papers, including the Wichita Eagle, which gave it a paragraph that was read by several people with the authority to make Hector Grimes's life legally complicated. Hector Grimes left Caldwell in January of 1883. He sold the saloon and one of his stores and left quietly one morning, and no one who watched him go seemed especially sorry to see him without the power he'd wielded so long. Whether he went somewhere else and built a new version of what he'd had here, Frances did not know and could not control, and she had learned to focus on what she could control. What she could control was the land. In January, with the worst of winter still pressing down on Kansas, she went to see it for the first time. Seth drove the wagon. They did not discuss the significance of this arrangement. He had simply appeared at Dorothea's with the wagon and a horse borrowed from the livery, and said he thought she might want company on the first visit. And Frances had looked at him in the thin winter light and nodded and climbed up onto the wagon seat without argument, which was itself a statement of how much things between them had changed. The land was beautiful. That was the thing she had not been prepared for, the sheer, startling beauty of it. 160 acres of Kansas prairie under a January sky, the grass dry and winter pale, the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property frozen to a thin silver ribbon. Thomas had chosen well. Whatever else might be said about Thomas's judgment, the land itself was exactly what he had described in his letters. Wide open and promising, with a swell of low hills to the north that broke the worst of the wind, and a stand of cottonwoods along the creek that would be magnificent in spring. Frances stood in the middle of it in her winter coat and looked in every direction, and for the first time since his letter had arrived, she felt Thomas very close to her, not as grief but as something else, a warmth, an approval, as though he were standing just outside her peripheral vision nodding at what she was seeing. Seth stood a few feet away and did not speak. He was learning her, she realized. He was learning the rhythm of when she needed space and when she did not, and he was adjusting to it without being asked, which was the most impressive and the most quietly devastating thing about him. "I am going to build a house here," she said. "I know," he said. "I am going to need help with that," she said. "Building the house, physically. I am capable of many things, but the structural elements of a house require more than one person." "I know that too," he said. She turned and looked at him. He was watching the hills to the north with that careful, composed expression of his breath making small clouds in the cold air. "Are you planning to stay in Caldwell?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That depends on whether there is a reason to." She turned back toward the land and was quiet for a long time, and the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like water. "Thomas told you I was capable," she said at last. "Did he tell you I was difficult?" "He told me you were worth it," Seth said. She did not say anything to that for a while. She stood in the middle of Thomas's land, which was her land, with the pale winter sky above and the frozen creek shining to the east, and the man who had followed her from the shadows for months standing 5 feet away being quietly and devastatingly patient, and she thought about what it meant to be worth something to someone who could not be deceived. "I think," she said finally, "that we should go back to town now and have tea with Mrs. Chen, and tomorrow you might come back and help me figure out the best place to break ground in the spring." Seth Barker looked at her then, and she looked back at him, and what passed between them in the thin January air was not quite a declaration and not quite a question, and was something considerably better than both. "I think that sounds right," he said. They drove back to Caldwell in the early winter dusk, sitting close on the wagon seat because the cold required it, and the distance between them was different from the distances that had preceded it. Not the distance of suspicion or caution, but something that felt, if she was honest about it, like the beginning of everything. Spring came to Kansas in its extravagant, overcompensating way, as if trying to apologize for winter. The cottonwoods along the creek on Frances's claim filled out in a week, going from bare silver branches to a wall of shimmering green seemingly overnight. The grass came back in waves, first pale, then vivid. The prairie exploded with wildflowers that had no care at all for the dignified severity of the landscape they were growing in. Seth had stayed in Caldwell. He had taken on two small cases that winter, a cattle theft investigation and a dispute between neighboring ranchers, but these were clearly secondary concerns. His main concern, which he never stated directly but which was legible in everything he did, was the building of Francis Lockhart's house. He was not doing it alone. He had organized a crew of 3 men, workers from town who were glad of winter employment, and between them and the materials that Warren Holt helped Francis purchase at fair prices from suppliers in Wichita, the structure went up with a speed that surprised everyone, including Francis. She was there every day. She had given up the hotel work in February, unwilling to continue giving Pierce the pleasure of shorting her wages now that she had other options, and she had taken up mending and alterations work that she could do from Dorothea's, which paid better and suited her independence more completely. This meant she could be on her land most afternoons, watching the house take shape, consulting on decisions, making the 100 small choices that turn a structure into a home. Seth was a good builder in the way that he was good at everything, meaning quietly and without drama, producing results that were solid and precise. He and Francis fell into an easy working rhythm that extended beyond the house and into the rest of their days. They had breakfast together most mornings at Mrs. Chen's, which had become a kind of fixed point in both their days. They talked about the land and the house and the legal situation, which was resolving itself by degrees, and about other things, about books and politics and the strange, unfinished business of westward expansion in America, about what the railroads were doing to the land, and whether the Homestead Act had delivered what it promised, and whether it would keep the promises it had not yet made. Francis discovered, incrementally, that Seth Barker was the most interesting man she had talked to in years. He had a mind that was precise and analytical, which she had already known from his detective work, but also a quiet philosophical bent that surprised her. He had read widely. He had opinions that were genuinely his own, not assembled from the received wisdom of his surroundings, and he was willing to revise them in the face of a good argument, which was rarer than it ought to have been. He was also funny, in a dry, understated way that crept up on you and landed before you realized it was coming. Francis had not laughed properly in a very long time, and the first time she laughed at something Seth said, a Tuesday morning in March over tea, she felt it like something coming loose inside her, something that had been bound tight for too long and suddenly, briefly, released. Seth had looked at her when she laughed with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something that was not quite surprise and not quite wonder but was somewhere between them, as though he had been waiting for that sound without knowing he was waiting for it. She had noticed that she noticed his expressions. She noticed a great many things about him, the way he moved, careful and economical, conserving energy like a man who had learned long ago that recklessness was a tax on the future. The way he spoke to Mrs. Chen and to Warren Holt and to the workers building her house, with the same attention and respect that he gave Francis herself. The way his hands looked working, large and competent, and she could not help thinking, gentle in their efficiency. She was falling in love with him. She knew it the way she knew her own handwriting, immediately and without ceremony. She was falling in love with Seth Barker, and it was, at this stage in her life, an occasion not for celebration but for careful, serious thought, because love was a territory she had been through before. Love had brought her to Kansas and left her alone in a grief so large, she had barely found her way around the edges of it. Love, or what she had built on the assumption of love's durability, had turned out to be contingent on the continued existence of the beloved, and that contingency was something she had not adequately planned for, and she was not sure she could afford to be so unprepared again. She raised this subject obliquely on a Sunday afternoon in April when they were walking along the creek line of her property, checking the drainage for the spring planting she had planned, and Seth was pointing out a spot near the cottonwoods where a small kitchen garden would get optimal light. "I want to be honest with you about something," Frances said. Seth stopped walking. He had learned by this point that when Frances said she wanted to be honest about something, it was worth your full attention. "I am not the same person I was before Thomas died," she said. "I am aware of that. I built myself into something harder out of necessity, and I am not entirely certain I know how to undo that, or whether undoing it would even be advisable." "I have not asked you to undo anything," Seth said. "I know," she said. "But you have been patient with me for months, and I want to be clear-eyed with you about whatever this is that has been growing between us, what it would mean for me. I am not the kind of woman who does things partially. If I trust someone, I trust them completely, and that is enormously frightening to me right now because I know what it costs." Seth was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek. A red-winged blackbird crossed the water in a flash of color and was gone. Then he said, "I was married once." She had not known this. She waited. "Her name was Clara. She died of a fever in the winter of 1876 in Texas. She was 23 years old." He said it simply, without drama, in the tone of a man who has carried something for a long time and knows exactly how heavy it is. "I know what it costs too," he said. "I know exactly what it costs, and I am standing here anyway." They stood by the creek in the April afternoon with the cottonwoods filling out above them, and Frances looked at this man who had lost someone and come through it, and crossed Kansas to help the widow of an acquaintance and stayed and built a house and been patient beyond any reasonable expectation, and she understood that what she was looking at was not a guarantee. There were no guarantees, but it was something very much like the truth, offered plainly and without conditions. She reached out and took his hand. It was a simple gesture, the simplest possible, and his hand closed around hers with a steadiness that moved through her like the first warm day after a long winter, settling into the places where the cold had lived and releasing them. "I would like to continue this conversation," she said, "over a very long time." "So would I," said Seth Barker. The house was completed in May of 1883. It was a solid, well-made house of 4 rooms, with a porch on the south side that caught the afternoon sun, and a large kitchen with a fireplace big enough to cook for a family, with windows that looked east toward the cottonwoods and west toward the swell of the hills that broke the wind. Frances stood on the porch the day they declared it finished and felt something she had not expected to feel: completeness. Not the mechanical, functional completeness of a problem solved, but a deeper, fuller sense of something being right. She moved out of Dorothea Marsh's boarding house on the 15th of May. Dorothea cried, briefly and with dignity, and pressed a jar of raspberry jam into Frances's hands and said she expected to be visited regularly. Frances promised she would be. The days that followed were the most genuinely happy days Frances had experienced since before Thomas's death, possibly since before many things. She was working her land, beginning the kitchen garden Seth had identified and breaking ground on a larger plot for a real crop next spring. She was building a new kind of life out of entirely new materials, and she was not doing it alone. Seth stayed in Caldwell, at the hotel now rather than Dorothea's, because Frances's house was appropriate for Frances, and she had not invited him to it on a permanent basis yet. And they were moving carefully through a courtship that was unlike any courtship Frances had ever imagined, full of real conversations and real silences and real work done side by side, a kind of intimacy that she had not known was possible with a man she had not yet kissed. He kissed her in June. They were on the porch in the evening, watching a thunderstorm build on the western horizon with the dramatic, unhurried grandeur that only the plains can produce, great towers of cloud going purple and black and lit from within by lightning, and the air smelling of rain and distance, and Frances had turned to say something. She could not afterward remember what, and found Seth looking at her with that expression that was not quite wonder and not quite something else. And then he leaned forward and kissed her. gently and seriously the way he did everything. She kissed him back. The thunder rolled across the prairie. "I have been thinking about doing that since January," he said when they separated. "I know," she said. He laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and it was the best sound she had heard in recent memory. She stored it alongside all the other things she had been storing, cataloging without naming, all the accumulated evidence of Seth Barker that had been building its case in her chest for months. Seth proposed to Frances on a Sunday morning in August of 1883, sitting at the table in her kitchen, with the early sun coming through the east window, and the smell of coffee between them, and Mrs. Chen's china on the shelf that Frances had bought as a splurge in the spring. He proposed in the most Seth-like way possible, which was to say directly and without theatrical embellishment. He said, "I would like to marry you, Frances. I would like to spend the rest of my life working on this land and living in this house and talking with you every morning and every evening, if you are willing." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the early August light. This serious, patient, honest man who had crossed her path in the dark on a road in November and been turned away twice before she finally let him in, who had known her husband and mourned him and come to help her in the only way he knew how, who had built her house with his hands and protected her without removing her agency and earned her trust without demanding it. She said, "I would like that very much." The wedding was small and proper, performed by the circuit preacher on a Saturday in September of 1883 with Dorothea Marsh and Elara Chen and Warren Holt as witnesses, and the whole thing conducted on the porch of Frances's house in the September sun, which was exactly where she wanted it. She wore a dress of dark blue cotton that she had made herself, good for a Sunday and durable enough for a Monday, which was her standard for everything. Seth wore his best coat and his cleanest hat and looked, Dorothea said afterward, as if he had been waiting for exactly this with the whole of his considerable patience. The minister, a cheerful man named Reeves who traveled the circuit with the energy of a man who has found his precise purpose in life, read the appropriate passages, and pronounced them husband and wife in the warm September air with the cottonwoods visible down the slope and a hawk turning in wide circles overhead, which Frances took as a good omen. She was Mrs. Frances Barker now, though she kept Lockhart as a second name, Lockhart being what she had built her life's second chapter on, and not a thing she was willing to fully set aside. Seth had not only accepted this, but had said it seemed exactly right. Their first year in that house was the kind of year that establishes a life's foundation. They planted a full crop in the spring of 1884, corn and sorghum, and a wheat field that came in beautifully that August, tall and gold, and moving in the wind like a living thing. The kitchen garden was productive beyond Frances's original estimate. Seth had taken on a few cases during the winter months, investigation work that brought in money that they banked carefully and used thoughtfully. They acquired 2 horses of their own, and 3 cattle, and a pig named Harriet whom Frances pretended to regard professionally but secretly found entertaining. Warren Holt came out to the property one Sunday in October of 1884 and sat at the kitchen table looking very lawyerly and satisfied, as he spread papers across the surface that represented the final, complete, legally bulletproof disposition of Frances's land claim. Everything Hector Grimes had attempted to contest was settled, documented, registered, and sealed. The land was hers, was theirs in every way the law could make a thing certain. Frances signed the final documents with the clear, decisive signature that she always used, and Warren shook her hand and shook Seth's hand, and said this was the most satisfying case he had handled in his brief career, and Frances said she was glad to have helped him establish a precedent of integrity, and they all laughed, and Warren stayed for supper. The letter from Cole Grimes's trial arrived in November, reporting that Cole had been found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 3 years in the territorial prison. Frances read the letter once, thoroughly, and then placed it in the trunk where she kept important documents, next to Thomas's deed and the early correspondence from Alderton, and she closed the lid and went back to the kitchen where Seth was making coffee. She told him the verdict and he nodded, and said he was glad it was resolved, and then asked if she wanted to ride out to the north field before the light went, because he had noticed a section of the fence that needed attention before winter. She said yes, and they rode out to the north field together in the November afternoon and fixed the fence, and rode back in the early dusk with the house lit and warm ahead of them, and that was that. In December of 1884, Frances told Seth she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning with the same directness that she brought to everything. She said, "I am going to have a child, and I am going to need your help with some of the heavier work over the next several months, and I would like to discuss what adjustments we should make to the spring planting plan to account for this." Seth had looked at her across the kitchen with an expression that moved through several registers simultaneously, surprise and joy, and something that she could only describe as the look of a man who has been given something larger than he knew to ask for. He said, "Frances, just her name, just that." "Yes," she said, and allowed herself to smile. He came around the table and held her, carefully, with that same quality of gentleness she had first noticed in the way his hands moved when he worked, and she let herself be held, which was something that had taken her a long time to learn to do without resistance. And she thought about Thomas, briefly, and with affection rather than grief, and she thought about the January day on this land when she had turned and seen Seth watching the hills. And she thought about how many refusals it had taken, and how many walls it had cost her, and how much all of it had been worth it. Their son was born in August of 1885, a loud and emphatic boy who arrived on a Tuesday afternoon and announced his presence to the surrounding countryside with a vigor that made the attending midwife, a no-nonsense woman from town named Mrs. Grady, comment that she had delivered many babies but rarely one with such clear opinions about the matter. They named him Thomas Seth Barker, Thomas for the man who had first loved Frances and brought her to this land, and Seth for the man who had stayed, and the doubling of the name felt not like a confusion but like a continuity, a way of honoring the full story of how this family had come into being. Thomas Seth Barker was, from the first days, exactly as determined and strong-willed as both his parents, which Seth noted with a certain philosophical equanimity, and Frances received as entirely correct and appropriate. He had Seth's dark eyes and Frances's way of looking directly at whatever interested him, assessing it with a seriousness that was almost comical in an infant. Dorothea Marsh came out to the farm the week after Thomas's birth and held him with practiced arms and declared him perfect, and cried again, with the same brief dignity she had brought to Frances's departure from the boarding house. Elara Chen came with food and the kind of practical wisdom about infants that she had accumulated from raising her own 3 children, and sat with Frances in the kitchen for 2 hours talking about everything and nothing, which was one of the things Frances most valued in Elara's company. Warren Holt sent a very proper letter of congratulations from his office in Caldwell, where he was now establishing a solid reputation as an honest and effective lawyer, the kind that the town had needed for a long time. Life on the Barker farm, as people in Caldwell had taken to calling it, settled into a rhythm that had the quality of something earned. The years moved through it. The land yielded and was worked and yielded again. The cottonwoods grew. The house developed the small additions and improvements of a place that is genuinely lived in. A second room built on when Thomas Seth was 2. A new roof on the barn Seth added in 1887. The porch railing Frances replaced herself one autumn when the original one rotted, doing it carefully and with evident satisfaction. Seth continued to take on occasional investigation cases, mostly in the winter months when the farm was less demanding, and these took him away from home sometimes for a week or 2 at a stretch. Frances had found, somewhat to her own surprise, that these absences were not the things she feared most. They were simply part of the texture of their life. Seth always came back. The certainty of that was not something she took for granted, but it was something she had come to trust with the same confidence she trusted the spring. Their second child was born in the autumn of 1888, another son, which suited Frances perfectly well. She had no particular need for a daughter. She had a farm and 2 sons and a husband who read to her in the evenings from whatever book had come in on the last stage from Wichita. And she had the land that Thomas Lockhart had claimed, and Seth Barker had helped her keep, and she herself had planted and tended and built on year by year. The second boy they named James Warren Barker, for no one in particular and a little for Warren Holt, who had been a genuine friend when they needed one. James was a quieter, more observing child than his brother, with a gift for watching things and a placidity that was entirely unlike either of his parents, but somehow suited the household perfectly, as though the family had needed precisely that quality and had arranged for it. On an evening in the fall of 1889, Seth and Frances sat on the porch after the boys were in bed, which was where they sat most evenings when the weather allowed, watching the last light go out of the western sky in the streaks of orange and purple that the Kansas evenings specialized in. The farm was quiet around them. The horses were settled. The corn had been in for a month, and the money from it was solid and more than adequate. The lamp in the window behind them threw a warm square of light onto the porch boards. Frances said, "I refused you 3 times. Seth was quiet a moment. Then he said, "You did. The first time on the road, you almost ran me over with your horse, and I told you I was fine and walked away." She was looking at the darkening sky with the contemplative expression she sometimes got when she was doing an accounting of things. "You were fine," he said. "You did not need me for that. The second time you came to my room at Dorothea's, and the third time in Mrs. Chen's store." She paused. "I was so certain you were a threat." "Given everything happening around you," Seth said, "that was not unreasonable." "No," she said, "but I also wonder sometimes what would have happened if I had refused the 4th time, on the street with those 2 men." Seth considered this. "You would have found another way," he said, and he meant it absolutely, which was one of the truest things about him. "Maybe," Frances said, "but I am glad I did not have to." She turned and looked at him. "I am glad you were patient enough to be there for a 4th time." He looked at her in the last of the evening light. This woman who had refused him 3 times and let him in on the 4th, who had built a house and a farm and a family with the same iron determination that had carried her through the worst of it, who still read by lamplight until he had to ask her to come to bed, who still had that quality of assessing everything with direct, unsparing attention that had the effect of making everything she turned it on feel genuinely seen. "I had no intention of giving up," he said. "I know," she said. "That was both infuriating and the most important thing about you." He laughed. She laughed too. It was a sound that had become, over the years, one of the established notes of the household, easy and warm and domestic in the best sense of that word. Presently Frances leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat that way in the deepening evening, while the first stars appeared over the Kansas horizon, and the farm settled around them with its sounds, the horses in the barn and the wind in the cottonwoods down the slope, and the small, sleeping weight of the house and everything in it. She thought about the road in November where they had first spoken. She thought about the boarding-house door with its chain and her own hard-held certainty. She thought about Thomas, with the quiet, clean sadness of a grief that had been fully accepted and transformed into something livable. She thought about the saloon floor and the kerosene lamp exploding and Seth Barker moving in the half-dark with a speed that had astounded her. She thought about January on this land, the frozen creek, the pale sky, and how she had reached out and taken his hand. She thought about all the times she had closed the door, and how the door had remained closed for exactly as long as she had needed it to, and how when she had finally opened it, the person on the other side had been exactly who she thought he was, and no different and no less. That was the rarest thing of all. That was the thing that the world did not reliably offer, and that she had been right to test and right to doubt and finally right to believe. She believed it now completely, the way she believed in the land under her feet and the seasons returning, without drama, without qualification, with the full weight of everything she knew and everything she had become. The stars spread across the Kansas sky in their ancient, indifferent abundance, the same stars that had been there before the cattle drives and the towns, and the desperate human ambitions that had rearranged the prairie. And Francis Barker, who had been Francis Lockhart, who had walked into a small town in October of 1882 with a battered trunk and an iron grief and the stubborn conviction that she owed it to the dead to live, sat on the porch of her house on her land with her husband's arm around her and her sons asleep inside, and her life built around her solid and good, and she was, at last, completely home. Not the home she had planned. Not the home she had imagined when she had first read Thomas's letters about Kansas and let herself believe in a future drawn in his enthusiastic hand. This was a different home, built on different ground from different materials, at a cost she had not anticipated. It was better. That was the thing she had not expected and could not have planned for. It was harder and truer and more thoroughly hers than any home she had lived in before. And in the morning she would rise before the sun and go into the kitchen and make coffee, and Seth would come in from checking the horses. And the boys would wake with their particular morning versions of themselves. Thomas loud and immediate and James quiet and observant. And there would be things to do and problems to solve and land to tend, and all of it, every practical, unglamorous, difficult piece of it, would be exactly right. That was the whole of the story, and it was enough. It was, by any measure she had ever used, more than enough. The lamp burned in the window, and the stars burned overhead, and Caldwell was a light on the dark horizon. And the Kansas night came down around the Barker farm, with the careful, even-handed mercy that the world sometimes offers to the people who have earned their rest.